Welcome back to The Gaze. I am Henry Keane and this is my show, Talk for More. I am happy to meet you in a digital platform of a new future Europe, a space where we find and highlight all of the most significant events in the region for you, and we'll speak about it with the best of experts. Today we will speak about the grain deal and its impacts on the world's market. And I'm so honored to give you our guest today, Mr. Joe Glauber, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and former chief economist at the United States Agricultural Department. Good afternoon, Mr. Glauber. Pardon me.
Hi, how are you?
Perfectly well, and you?
Very good.
Let me talk you through a short covering story, and then I will be asking my questions. Russian drones attacked and damaged the harbor and grain storage facilities in the south of Ukraine's coast in Odessa region, setting some of the buildings and facilities on fire. Russia stepped up to attacks on Ukrainian agricultural and port infrastructure after the Kremlin refused to extend the Black Sea grain deal that had allowed for exports of Ukrainian grain. The enemy is trying to destroy Ukrainian grain, attacking industrial and port infrastructure. Unfortunately, there were missiles incoming. The silo was damaged and the fires broke out at the site. Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson of the Ukrainian Army South, said. Mr. Brachuk also added, Russia is trying to cut Ukraine out of the future grain agreement and, most importantly, to strategically displace our country from the global food market. However, Ukraine's Danube river ports became a vital lifeline for Ukraine's grain exports after Russia left the Black Sea grain deal in mid-July. So my question to you, Mr. Glauber, as an expert, the point of these attacks. I mean, does Russia really want to destroy the Ukrainian harbors and ports and all the infrastructure? And in your opinion, as an expert, can Russia succeed with all that, doing this?
Yeah, I know this is a very unwelcome development, obviously. The pulling out of the Black Sea grain agreement was very unfortunate. I think, there's no question that's been vital for Ukraine to be able to export grain. But Ukraine has been investing in particularly the ports on the Danube as an alternative way, albeit a little more costly, but still less costly than shipping overland through Poland or Slovakia. So this escalation, it certainly seems like it's an attempt by Russia to prevent Ukraine from exporting grain in any sort of fashion.
Thank you very much for your answer. The deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey a year ago had allowed Ukraine to keep exports flowing through its deep water ports on the Black Sea in order to ease a global food crisis.
The Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey, delivered over 32 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs to the world.
Non cessiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina, dove la guerra distrugge tutto, anche il grano.
The normal access of Ukrainian grain to international markets.
Russia quit the deal on July 17th, complaining that sanctions on its own grain and fertilizers exports had not been eased and warning that ships heading to Ukrainian seaports could be considered military targets from now on. As a result of the deal's collapse, Ukrainian grain exports in July were down 40% from June, analysts said. On the other hand, the threat forced Ukraine, instead of shipping through sea coastal ports, to funnel more grain shipments through the Danube river ports, which had handled at least a quarter of all exports before the Black Sea Agreement ended. The Black Sea Grain Agreement. Was it really that important? And for who? For Ukraine? For the rest of the world?
Well, unfortunately, the war is exacted a terrible toll on Ukraine agriculture, right? I mean, its production now is down 35-40%. If you think back last year, at the time the grain agreement went into effect, the agreement was so important because, Ukraine had so many inventories at the time because they were unable to market 2021 crops. They were the wheat crop that was just coming off that had been planted in fall of 2021 prior to the war. Good harvest, trying to get that into storage and try to get it to market. And there was real concern that by October and November that there would just be no storage available, and that a lot of crops would have to be stored on the ground and subject to spoil and other things. I think the agreement was vital in terms of all of a sudden boosting exports to the 4 to 5 million ton area that helps, helped get a lot of those supplies to market. But, as we look forward, the production is down, and that means exports are down as well. But there still has to be a way to get those supplies to market. There's I think with the Black Sea closed and with disruptions on the Ukraine or the Danube ports, I think the real concern is that we would come up against storage problems again. That all this means, of course, low prices for Ukraine farmers, and I think that's the real damage in one sense, is that farmers who are already paying very high input costs and not being able to see good prices to help profitability there.
So Ukraine is the country to suffer the most from what Russia did, killing the deal.
Well, I think directly there's no question. The world loses, obviously, as well. One is because it loses Ukraine as a very major grain exporter. We've already, I would argue that they've already lost part of it this year by the fact that production is down. And I think if this continues, obviously, next year doesn't look more favorable, certainly. And to the degree that Ukraine, was one of the top 5 grain exporters in the world, to have them, their position now substantially less, that means the world has to find grain. And there is a lot of grain in the world right now, but all it would take is a drought or a major disruption somewhere else in the world,
Absolutely.
and we would see very high prices.
In terms of Russia, what is it? A blackmail? An attempt of blackmailing the world with the probable, possible famine, with Hunger Games. Is that the reason?
Yeah, frankly, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to move away much more than the obvious one, that it's a war, and they are doing, this is a very awful act, I think, because it hits so many people. These shouldn't be viewed as military targets, I think, and yet they have been, and almost from the beginning. So I think that's the real sad aspect of this, and the dreadful aspect of it, frankly. Not just obviously for the Ukraine people, but also for globally, for the world's hungry and those who import these grains.
Thank you. The Kremlin has repeatedly stated that the grain under the Black Sea Agreement goes to Europe and not to those countries in need. Well, please educate me. How the grain from the world markets gets to countries? What are these main logistical arteries? What are the ways?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I think it's a bit misunderstood by many. First of all, Ukraine is a very large producer of maize. Maize typically is sold not so much to developing countries, because the maize that is produced and sold by Ukraine is for animals, for the most part. And these are animal feed, and that goes to countries like Europe or China that import big quantities of this. So I think maize is a separate category, although we have seen a lot of maize go to the Mideast and North Africa from Ukraine through the Black Sea Grain Agreement. But turning to wheat, I think wheat is one that, yes, Ukraine prior to the war, shipped grain everywhere. And had been an increasing presence in many markets, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Through the Black Sea Grain Agreement, and largely through World Food Program, we saw 4 or 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Sudan, as recipients of wheat. But, particularly because in the early months of the war, Ukraine went before the Black Sea Grain Agreement, it was very difficult to get wheat out to this normal market. So some did end up in Europe. But I think we look at countries like Bangladesh or Indonesia or some of the other countries that were importing in South Asia weren't able to import as much. But again, I think Ukraine has done an incredible job just getting grain to the market, given these harsh circumstances. So. And lastly, I would say that having the grain on the world market is good for everyone, because that lowers prices, and that's good for consumers. So even if it's not going individually to a specific country, it is being bought by someone at lower prices that have, everyone benefits.
Yeah, well, that someone probably just has no choice. You have to buy this grain, and Ukraine has to sell it. So maybe, I'm in no way saying that the war is a good thing, but maybe it's kind of an impetus to some other ways for the grain delivery for the world, for the Western world, and for Ukraine. Do you think that is the case?
Well, I would say this. I think the markets have been remarkably resilient in the world. So if you look at countries like Egypt that have imported a lot of grain from the Mideast, or from the Black Sea rather, they have found other suppliers because, again, there's a lot of other countries in the world that grow wheat and export wheat. I think these buyers, by the way, will turn right back to the Black Sea, I think, once the war is over and once Ukraine is able to export wheat again in the quantities they were doing pre-war levels. I think, Ukraine is very attractively located, particularly for those countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, but as we've seen from all over, because Ukraine really has, if you look at the scope of their exports, they go to countries all over the world.
Right, but look who's talking now. Putin promised to replace Ukrainian grain on the world market with Russian grain. According to him, the Russian Federation produced more than 100 million tons of grain last year, while Ukraine produced approximately 55 million tons. He also noted that he is ready to supply Russian grain to African countries for free. What a generous Tsar. According to him, in the next 2-4 months, the Russian Federation will be ready to provide up to 50,000 tons of grain to African countries such as Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, the Eritrea, free of charge. The Russian president promised to reimburse the costs of delivering Russian grain to countries on the African continent. The representatives of the above-mentioned countries that were present in the hall applauded to that as one in unity. But can Russia really replace Ukraine in terms of...
No, I don't think they can. I mean, they certainly may be able to export more grain to sub-Saharan Africa, for example. It accounts for roughly less than 20% of their total exports normally go to sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously they could switch more, but Ukraine is, again, such a major producer to sort of take over the shares of Ukraine. I think that would have to be a huge increase in Russian wheat production, and I don't see that. I mean, they had understand that they had a record crop this year. This in 2022, it was enormous wheat crop, and I think all the records show that they were able to export wheat all over, in fairly large quantities this year. But I think the other thing is that I think this strikes me as a real political ploy on the part of Putin, and just in the sense of these countries have been largely neutral in the war. They haven't wanted to pick sides, so they said, well, we don't want to get on, so they've taken, have tended not to get involved with the votes on the United Nations or abstain from voting. But when Russia suspended the agreement back in October, the African Union was one of the first entities that was there in Moscow talking to Putin about extending the agreement. And I think that So I think Putin understands the importance, the political importance of trying to make pledges to Africa. But, you know, I saw other quotes from African leaders saying, okay, yeah, it's great that you're offering us free grain, but we want the Black Sea grain agreement. So I think there's no question that over the long run, that's, you know, what Africa needs more than anything else is a normalized Ukraine.
I'm absolutely with you. You're
exporting back to pre-war levels and
But the thing is that making a pledge is one thing. To implementing it into life is a totally different thing. So promising, putting promises.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, yeah. So,
yeah, and I think that, for example, Russia didn't export like Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, obviously, because of the war, because of the fact that for 5 months last year, there was almost no exports out, certainly not out through the Black Sea.
Absolutely, a very good point.
And so at a key time when wheat is normally exported, that's the other thing, is understand that these exports of grains are quite seasonal within the year. You know, wheat is harvested in summer, early fall. It normally goes out over the early months of the next year. Then maize follows. And, you know, it just so happens that the time the wheat was they were trying to export wheat, they weren't able to. I think something like, I remember you probably have these numbers in front of you, but I think only something like 65-70% of the wheat had been exported of the 21 crop at the time the war came. So there was still a lot of wheat to be exported, and that maize, I think, only 50%. So of the 21 crop, not talking 22. So a lot of grain just wasn't making its way out. But I think if you look around the world, that, you know, again, once the Black Sea opened, you did see exports to East Africa from Ukraine.
Fair enough.
And I think, you know, Russia was exported less to East Africa last year, a little more to West Africa. But it's still, again, you can't look at one versus the other. I think this is something where Africa needs grain from both, and you know, needs wheat, and Russia can't supplement or can't substitute for what's lacking from Ukraine.
A large part of the Russian grain gathered last year was gathered, what a surprise, on the occupied territories of Ukraine. And then this stolen grain was exported through the stolen ports of Crimea and Azov Sea. Isn't it obvious to the world and to African countries that they're actually dealing with a thug?
Yeah, well, the whole issue is stolen grain. You're absolutely right, and I think that certainly it has been documented in the sense of organizations that monitor the shipping data and other things with satellite data and other things have seen these ships leave occupied areas. The harder thing is to get an idea of the magnitude of these and then where they end up in terms of destinations. I mean, some of it, we have seen where ships have been tracked into places like Lebanon or other places, but yeah, I think that there is a lot of concern there, and I think some countries have done a very good job of publicizing these ships and trying to get public opinion against accepting those sorts of shipments. But grain, you know, unfortunately, it has a way of it gets harder and harder to track once it gets to a country and other things. So again, to get a full idea of magnitude of this, I think is a bit more challenging, and you know, it's also hampered by the fact that, frankly, Russia doesn't report or hasn't reported trade statistics for over a year. They claim they are going to restart, but it's been very difficult to get that data. So trying to do one's detective work, as it were, to try to understand where grains are coming from and where they're going has been certainly much more problematic. A lot of the shipment data, which is tracked via transponders, a lot of the traffic in the Black Sea transponders were turned off. So, and then mysteriously they would reemerge, near Turkey. So
Pardon me, even turning off the transponder is illegal, so you can track that point when it was turned off and everything. But exactly, that's a kind of a detective story more than, than a business. But there are buyers and there are sellers, and they will continue buying and selling because they have simply no choice.
Well, you're absolutely right that unfortunately one can always find a buyer for contraband. I mean, be it stolen grain or stolen anything, and I think that the world needs to be very clear about that. But it's tough. The tough thing, of course, is that it's food we're talking about, not weapons or not other sorts of contraband. And I think that but all the same, I think the idea of this being stolen grain, I think countries should be very wary of what they're buying and where this grain is being sourced.
Thank you. As a result of the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant by Russian troops, the loss of the agricultural products already amounts to about 2 million tons. The losses of the agricultural sector will only continue to rise over time, said Serhiy Labazyuk, a member of the Committee of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on Agrarian and Land Policy. According to him, farmers will be forced to change the structure of sowing. A certain parts of the territories that were flooded will be able to return to work in a year or two, but there will be no irrigation. To use properly irrigated land will become possible only after a complete victory of Ukraine, the expulsion of the Russian occupying army from Ukrainian lands, and the restoration of the Kakhovka Dam, which is quite likely building a new modern facility, and that takes huge time and effort and money. Mr. Labazyuk also reminded about the risk of desert expansion in the Kherson region due to the fact, like I mentioned before, it is impossible to irrigate the land that is now prone to corrosion. If the destructive process begins, some areas, and these are vast territories that we're talking here about, will no longer be able to be used for agricultural production. This one will be more like also rhetorical. Obviously, the world is just not ready for a terror of that mind-boggling scale, that large atrocities, that ecocide, genocide, or let's call it foodicide attempt of Russia now. Do you believe that in the future, after Ukraine wins, the international organizations are subject to change in any way? Or is our international, United States of whatever, and they will literally looking into the face of new war, will keep on expressing their deep concerns, and that's it, because this is mostly what they do.
Yeah, I know. I think in particular for, as you mentioned, with the dam infrastructure, this is going to require heavy investments to try to repair, to get this land. I mean, it already has seen the developments over the last 10, 15 years, and then to have this breach and in particular the destruction to the irrigation. I think it's important, it's obviously important not just for grain, but there was a lot of vegetable production and other things in that region, which, certainly is now jeopardized. And I think that this, we don't have to stop there. I mean, look at just the demining efforts of trying to give assurances to farmers that their lands have been decontaminated from arsenal and other things. I think this is going to be is going to require very heavy investments on the part of Ukraine's allies to help bring agriculture back. And some of that obviously can come from private companies and others who will want to see that happen. But I think this just says that post hostilities, I think there's going to be heavy requirements for, to bring Ukraine back. to its full potential as an agricultural powerhouse.
The post-hostilities. Well, if we talk about a list of countries that were damaged, harmed by disrupting almost everything on the food security market, on the food market and with the food security, what 5 countries would you name? If we say that Ukraine is first, the next 3 or 4 countries, if you can name them?
Oh boy, well, it's difficult. I mean, you'd have to go into the Horn of Africa, I think. I mean, if you're looking for historical examples, of course, you could go back to, the mid-century wars, World War II and things like that. But more recently, certainly Africa's had a lot of areas. You think about Cambodia, even. The wars in Southeast Asia. You still have areas there that have heavy mine concentrations and things like that. And yeah, I mean, these are horrible stories, and unfortunately for many of these countries, they're neglected, right? I mean, once the war has died down or the hostilities have died down, people tend to forget, and that's where the investments really have to come at that point. And I think that hopefully we won't see that with Ukraine. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to ask if Europe, in any way, is harmed and will be harmed more with all this situation, with all the shocks on the market.
I'm sorry.
Harmed and damaged in any business or economic way, in any economic way, by this food insecurity, what is going on, because Russia went out of the deal, because Russia is shelling the harbor and port infrastructure. Do you think that Europe, because I have a feeling that Europe is just, at the moment, helping Ukraine a lot. Really, it is a fact. But also, it's like, bought some kind of a ticket or show and just waiting for how the deal is going to turn. Or maybe this is just my personal feeling, my personal.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have my sense. You would have better sense, I think, being where you are. All mine is largely from reading wire clips and reading statements from leaders. And you're right. I think the at least on the political side, they've been very strong support. I think to me. The things that Europe probably could do a better job addressing is this sort of tension with countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, even, in terms of saying, okay, look, this is what's going to have to happen over the next while this war is going on, is that this is going to be a pathway for grain, and that if your farmers need compensation, then we can help with compensation. But not, let's don't use this as a point of conflict, because I think that's generally my sense is that these countries have been very, very supportive of Ukraine. And to me, it's a shame that something like, all of a sudden to have these agricultural issues with people complaining about their prices in their country being lower. That is, I think that's true, but the fact is, well, then you can help that by compensating them, providing compensation rather than necessarily doing something that ultimately penalizes Ukraine, because I think the main thing is to try to get this provide venues for this grain to get out, and grain and other agricultural products to get out to the world.
You mentioned miles and explosives. Ukraine is currently losing huge areas of fertile agricultural land, in particular littered with explosives. Also, almost the entire south of Ukraine will remain with no water supply after the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam. To what extent has the war against Ukraine already affected and will affect the world markets? What I mean is prices, possible famine in some countries, a constant shock on the market. Is the market, the food market, the global food market, will survive? Or it has to be restructured and it will be restructured by what is going on in any way, or it will remain almost the same, just maybe waiting until everything, the storm is over, and then going back
Well,
to...
I think it's more with a sharply diminished production capacity from Ukraine, which is what this war has meant, that it's more waiting for a disaster to strike. I mean, hopefully you don't have that, right? But the real concern to me is that because we're losing several million tons from Ukraine of grain that would normally make its way out to the rest of the world, that just means that other countries have to provide that. And, we have our global stock levels are at have been drawn down, not just from Ukraine, but also from droughts and other things over the last 2 or 3 years. So that, when you look at wheat supplies or wheat stocks held by the major exporting countries, they're pretty low relative to world historical levels, probably the lowest since 2007-8, a time when we had very high wheat prices. And I think because of that, because we don't have large grain stores, means that if there are droughts elsewhere, that means the world has to find supplies, and otherwise we'll see high prices. And so, again, I liken it, again, please don't misunderstand. This is a terrible tragedy, particularly for the Ukraine people. But its effect on production is much like a drought, right? I mean, if you're thinking of a very large drought, a 30% loss in production, that would be seen as a catastrophic drought in many countries of the size of Ukraine. And so to think that you have a country that's having that sort of production effect, and if you were to have problems elsewhere, you could see prices rise very, very quickly. And I think that's why we've seen so much volatility in the global markets for both wheat and maize, is that the world looks and says, well, it looks like they're having problems in Canada for their wheat crop or whatever. And you see some increases in price volatility. Again, right now, ample supplies in the world, so prices have been at fairly low levels relative to the spikes that we saw in the spring of 2022 following the invasion. But prices are still high relative to where they were 5 years ago. And again, because stocks are low and other things, and the fact you have a diminished production capacity in one of the major breadbaskets of the world, that's the risk, I think, that one looks at. So I don't think the world is complacent or waiting. I think we've been very fortunate over the last year to have essentially very good crops globally, and so despite the fact that Ukraine wasn't able to get a lot of its grain to the market, there was a lot of grain elsewhere. All it would take is a major a drought in another major breadbasket to have serious problems. And so hopefully we don't have those, but more importantly, hopefully we can return Ukraine to back to its pre-war levels at some point, sooner rather than later.
Yeah. You just took in my words what I wanted to say, dear sir. Thank you very much. Let us talk for more, and let us now ask someone who is not even someone and is not even who, but rather something and what. Yet it turns out to be, in some cases, way more reasonable than the human intellect. Well, in most cases, to say the truth. Artificial intellect, our Deus ex machina, ChatGPT answers a question. I will ask our ChatGPT a question, and then I will ask a question to you, sir, if that is all right and you're happy to comment.
Sure.
All right, thank you. So our question was, what will happen if Ukraine is removed from the world food market? ChatGPT answers. If Ukraine were to be removed from the world food market, it would have several potential consequences, both for Ukraine itself and for the global food market. First, Global food supply. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of agricultural products. Its removal from the world food market could lead to a decrease in global food supply, especially for commodities like grain. This could potentially contribute to food price increases and supply disruptions in various regions that rely on Ukrainian exports. And number two, rise in food prices. The reduction in global food supply due to Ukraine's absence could lead to higher food prices worldwide. Countries that heavily rely on Ukrainian agricultural products may experience shortages, leading to increased costs for consumers. Well, my question is, those coulds and woulds and mays, this is just a virtual expert. And these are actually wills, right? I mean, it will happen. It will inevitably happen to the market. The prices will soar if one of the largest players just leaves the table. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I would caveat it a bit, just in the sense of we have seen, again, there's a question, does this mean no exports out of Ukraine or diminished exports? So, the current situation, I think, is a perfect case in point. We do see, prices at again, what I would consider pre-war levels, more reasonable levels, but still high. They aren't spiking like they were 12 months ago, but you can see just with over the last 2 weeks, it doesn't take much to get the markets reacting to bombings of river port facilities, bombings of the Odessa port facilities. So the world is very much concerned about it. So I think the worrisome thing is that ChatGPT sounds like they could replace me ultimately, because I don't think my answer would be that different from what. We'll probably have a Chat GPT on your site asking the questions and the Chat GPT on mine answering them. But yeah, it certainly is my concern too. I mean, I think this is to look at the volatility in the world right now, and to again, you can get by with good grain, bumper crops elsewhere, but all it takes is a problem. And I'm looking at a crop in the U.S. which 3 weeks ago was looking very poor. It looks better now, but these are again, weather markets can do a lot of funny things, as Ukraine knows as well. You can look back to 2010, for example, when you had very, very dry crops and poor yields. It's just to say, I mean, these are lots of volatility. And so whenever there's volatility, all it takes is, and again, without a lot of grain stocks to buffer those effects. I think that's the other key thing. And without Ukraine in the market, it's very hard to build stocks over time. So that's the other big thing.
What if Ukraine will offer to the world not just a usual range of products? I mean, grain, maize, and everything, but some sort of food sub-products from grain sub-products. Would the market notice that? Would it have any effects on the market? Because maybe this is the way out for Ukraine.
Yeah, it's tough, I think, with value-added products, just because they require oftentimes more handling, in terms of, for example, wheat flour. It just wouldn't make sense to be exporting wheat flour to the world. Vegetable oil, of course, sunflower oil, you did in the past, although, interestingly, in 2022, or after the war started, a lot more sunflower seed was exported to places like Bulgaria that ended up processing a lot of that seed. I think some of that was due to the fact that some crushing facilities were in dangerous areas, and I've heard, you would know better, but there may be labor issues as well, just in the sense of finding enough people to operate facilities early on, particularly early on in the war. But you do see, however, signs that some farmers are switching to higher value crops just because of the problems with prices in the country, right? So you're for crops that require a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, for example, those are now, trying to get imported fertilizers certainly are also very costly because it's the same issue in reverse from trying to export something. Importing costs are expensive as well. But if you look at the overall profitability of individual crops, there, at least what I'm seeing and what economists within your country are reporting to me is that there has been some switching to sunflower and rapeseed and some of the other oilseed crops, which are a little more profitable. So, that happens the world over, but I'm not sure, for example, just saying, well, let's export higher value crops would necessarily, or higher value and more processed products would necessarily be an answer here in the short run. Ukraine does what it does best, exporting bulk wheat and maize and that sort of thing. And it's just hard to transform that overnight. And you still need transportation. You still, in fact, even more so, I would argue, that the costs are even higher just because of the transporting and other things.
Well, you just have to understand that you say, we have to look at this, we have to look at that, but you are looking...
No, absolutely.
As a professional, I'm just an observer. And as an observer, I'm like looking at the Netherlands. For example, Netherlands is supplying all sorts of foods to almost every country in the world. Right. Is there a chance for Ukraine to become new Netherlands for the world?
You need a Black Sea. Just like they have, that's the problem. That's the problem, is that it doesn't, you're talking about Netherlands, you're not talking about a landlocked, essentially landlocked, that's the real tragedy here with taking one of the greatest resources Ukraine has, apart from its people and its land. You also have access to the Black Sea with deep water ports that make that grain as cheap as any grain to particularly if you're a country sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean, or I would argue most around the world, that is the best price quality grain you can get, right? And to block all that and to add all these additional costs to try to get it through the Danube and on barges to where it can be. All this is great as an alternative, but the primary is through the Black Sea, and shutting that off is the real tragedy.
Well, the primary is just missing for the moment. Let's hope something will change in the nearest future. The next topic of our chat GPT, which is in no way to replace our dear guest. Ukrainian agricultural exports are an important part of many countries' supply chains. The removal of Ukraine from the world food market could disrupt the supply chains, leading to challenges for food processors, manufacturers, and retailers who rely on Ukrainian agricultural inputs. But my question is, the whole world relies on Ukrainian agricultural inputs. So maybe the world has to do something about it right now? What would you do as a professional, as an expert? What would you do? Let us speculate. Let us just a short minute off for speculation. What would you do if you would have a power to change the situation? Of course, I'm not talking about the grain of the Black Sea grain deal. Let's see that there is no Black Sea grain deal.
Yeah, taking the obvious ones off the table of the war or anything like that. Then you're talking about investments in alternative ways of shipping. I think storage, helping with storage facilities would be important. Here's the dilemma is, so much of these investment decisions from the private sector, the calculus that has to go on is say, well, how long would this last? Is this something that next year we have normalized, the war's over, everyone's back to shipping through the Black Sea, then all these investments we've built elsewhere have less value, right? I don't think, unfortunately, don't get me wrong, I'm not, at this point, I think it's very, very difficult to foresee 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, any of that.
Absolutely.
But the, in terms of the short-term investments, to try to alleviate the problems of things like storage, and then certainly if there's any ways of lowering the costs of transport through these alternative pathways out, those are really the key thing. And I know a lot of private investment has already gone on, particularly on the Ukraine, on the Danube river ports, which has really emerged as an important conduit for grain and other things. But I think, it's going to need a steady commitment there. And again, I keep getting back to this, the commitment to rebuild is really to me, the most important aspect of all of this is to the investments that are going to be needed to rebuild infrastructure and, to help the agricultural sector get back on its feet.
You mean that sector that was shelled and bombed by Russia, just almost?
Yeah, exactly, and demined and other things as well. Yeah,
How long do you think this is going to take, and how costly is it? Just roughly, because
I don't have a clue either. I've heard estimates for €1,000 or so per hectare. When you can buy a hectare for about that amount, it makes for, I don't know. I'm always wary of these estimates, particularly not being on the ground there, and nor is it necessarily my field of expertise. But just to say, I think we're talking about very costly. And if you look at, again, experiences elsewhere, those are several years in terms of, people still talk about Cambodia and places like that are in Vietnam that are still, finding ordnance, still have areas that are mined and haven't been demined. So, it's going to require a concerted effort. I was in a meeting the other day where people were talking about demining efforts and all the efforts that are ongoing. But again, to me, this is just starting. This is really going to have to be a major investment over time to ensure that to bring these lands back into production.
Thank you very much, sir. Shift in trade dynamics is another topic that bothers our ChatGPT experts. All the agricultural exporting countries might try to fill the gap left by Ukrainians' absence, potentially leading to shifts in global trade dynamics. This could result in increased competition among other major agricultural exporters, potentially affecting global trade agreements and negotiations. Now, that is an interesting point. Which countries could that be, you think? Do you think that Russia can be that? New post-war Russia, for example?
Well, I think there's no question, whenever there's disruptions in supplies, and again, I would argue that's true with droughts and other things, that trade patterns change. Look at the trade war between U.S. and China, very disruptive. The U.S. had been supplying about half the soybeans that China imports annually. When that trade war happened, all that trade pretty much shifted to Brazil. And yet, 2 years later, it was normalized again. Brazil's market share has increased. I think it would have increased anyway, but that certainly was an impetus to import more from Brazil. And so those are the sorts of things you worry about, I guess, with longer term grain agreements and things like that between countries. Again, Russia is, as you had mentioned earlier in the show, active about cultivating trade relationships with sub-Saharan Africa and other sorts of things. But again, don't get me wrong. I think what's to me, when people ask me, so let me stop. Let me just say this. When people have asked me, well, shouldn't countries be diversifying? And just by saying, okay, well, we can't depend on the Black Sea because it's so volatile. You may, and I keep reminding, look, this is cheap grain. And for the most part, you look at countries like Egypt, they are buying week to week. This isn't something that they're committing for a year in advance to buy grain from Ukraine and Russia. They're buying week to week. They're looking for cheap. I don't mean this in a pejorative way. They're looking for the lowest cost supplies they can get. Ukraine provides that. They are and I think that will, again, assuming a normalization once the war is over, they will be right back in being a major producer, and countries will go right back to buying from grain. But I think in the disruption, I think you are seeing a lot of changes in grain. Remember, 20 years ago, when Ukraine and both Ukraine and Russia were much smaller exporters, and in fact, in some cases, net importers of grains. The Eastern Mediterranean looked very different. They bought a lot of grain from the U.S., bought a lot of grain from France, bought a lot of grain from Australia. That all changed once the supplies came on and production really took off in Ukraine. And so I think that will return again, but it's predicated on having a healthy agricultural sector in Ukraine, predicated on having ready access to ports on the Black Sea.
Another observer thought just came to my mind. What if we are not giving the fish, but giving the fishing rod to African countries? What if to make the Central Africa a producer of grain? Is that even possible, of a major producer to distribute it in an African continent? Just speculating as an observer.
Yeah,
is that possible?
I think we're a long way off from that. I mean, this has been a huge development challenge to increase productivity in Africa. But remember, I think more importantly, unlike the Mideast, North Africa, where you see wheat consumption is a very large portion of their diet. Bread consumption may be, over 50% of calories coming in a household. It's much less in many areas of Africa. You see some wheat consumption along the east coast of Africa. So if you look at Ethiopia, Somalia, those are traditional wheat producers. They don't produce enough to feed their population, so they do some importing. But if you look at West Africa, I lived in Mali for a number of years, and there you see a lot of traditional grain consumption of millet and sorghum, which certainly they could be helped by improved productivity there. You do see some wheat consumption particularly in urban areas where people will buy bread to supplement calories, but they're normally consuming rice or millet or sorghum along with that. So I don't see that, and frankly, wheat is not. The climate is not suited for wheat production in Central Africa, where you mentioned, again, drier areas, some drier areas are more temperate areas, I guess I should say, like Southern Africa, again, East Africa, you see some production of wheat, but West Africa, very little, maize, yes, a little bit more potential for maize production there. But I think where Africa really could be helped, I think, is increased productivity for a lot of the more local grains, if you will, millet and sorghum and teff and things like that.
Don't get me wrong. It was just
fantasies.
I was just asking.
I went on too long about that. But
exactly. I mean, it would be good. It would be perfect. Of course, it is a huge challenge, but maybe that will be this is the huge challenge that the world is going through now. So why not for Central Africa to change?
And look, there's certainly, look at the U.S. So the U.S. was an enormous. Prior to the growth of Russia and Ukraine, U.S. was one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world. The growth of the Black Sea combined with the fact that both maize and soybean production was more profitable in the U.S., saw this big switch for a lot of growers in the U.S. said, now I can plant varieties that will work in the areas where I used to grow wheat. So you see switches like that, and you could see increased wheat production in some areas of the world. Look at India. India was exported 5 years ago, exported maybe 1 ton a year, maybe 2 tons, 2 million tons. This past 2 years, they were exporting 8 million tons each year. So there are areas of the world that when prices are high, they plant more wheat and they're able to sell it. So again, you're right about that. The sense that if there's a long-term absence from the market will compensate by seeing, with higher prices, and that will bring in more production from somewhere.
Thank you very much for your detailed answer again, sir. Well, let us talk about another aspect of the thing, logistics and transportation. Ukraine and Croatia agreed on the use of Croatian ports for the exports of Ukrainian grain. With the withdrawal of the Russian Federation from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Ukrainian food exports became an important topic of negotiations between the two countries. Dmytro Kuleba emphasized, we agreed on the possibility of using Croatian ports on the Danube and the Adriatic Sea for the transportation of Ukrainian grain. We will now work on creating the most efficient logistics to these ports and making the most of this opportunity. Every contribution to unlocking exports, every door opened, is a real, effective contribution to world food security. Is it even real? And is it profitable to use Croatian ports for Ukrainian grain? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm skeptical, I guess. I mean, I think that again, I can certainly understand, either by bringing grain to Croatian ports on the Danube or to the Adriatic. It's just that again, you have all the problems of every time you have to take grain off of one conveyance and put it on another, that's costs, right? So moving it from truck to barge or from truck to rail to barge or in ports, all that costs money. So it will be interesting to see if how much of that grain actually ultimately moves that way. But again, I certainly understand trying to find alternatives, and I think we are seeing investment certainly in Western Ukraine, in the neighboring countries, and certainly more importantly on the Danube ports and bordering Romania, where we have seen investments there, and those weren't really seen as very viable. I mean, that's certainly not where the bulk of the trade was moving prior to the war. So,
my last question for today. As for you, was the grain deal beneficial for Ukraine in terms of economics? Well, let us just speculate again. What would happen if there would be no grain deal at all?
If there had been no grain deal,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. No. So I think that would have been devastating for Ukraine producers and the world. I mean, I think we would have to have. One is, I think that there would have been very few incentives to plant grain last fall if we hadn't been able to move, if the world hadn't been able to buy the grain that they were able to buy last year through the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I think it would have caused some serious disruptions. I mean, think about China, purchasing some 5-6 million tons of maize and other products this past year. That would have had to come out of somewhere else, and I think that we would have seen higher prices. So I think there's no question the world, both the world and Ukraine, gained immensely from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and Yeah, I think we would have seen a much different price patterns if it hadn't been for that.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Glauber, for your expertise, for your time. It was a great pleasure having you with us today.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. This was excellent.
It was Joe Glauber, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and former Chief Economist in the U.S. Agriculture Department. And for now, I just must say my goodbyes. I'm Henry Keane, and it was my show Talk for More. If you liked the episode, press the like button. If you didn't like it for some reason, write in the comments section below why is that, and press the bell to be the first to see the most up-to-date information. Do not forget to subscribe to the Gaze platform on YouTube and our social media. We talk for more very soon. Keep in touch.